My name is Arthur. I'm 72 years old, and I remember the day my life took a turn I never saw coming. It wasn't in a storm or a doctor's office, but in the stuffy, wood-paneled meeting room of the Oak Haven Town Hall. I was there to sign the papers for an inheritance from a cousin I barely knew, the old, abandoned railway station at the edge of town. As I took the pen, Mayor Thompson, a man whose smile never quite reaches his eyes, clapped me on the shoulder, a little too hard. "Well, Arthur, congratulations," he said, his voice booming for everyone to hear. "You're now the proud owner of the biggest pile of rust and rotten wood in the county." A wave of chuckles and smirks went through the room. They weren't just laughing at the building, they were laughing at me. What would you do if everyone you've known your whole life laughed at you for inheriting a ruin? Listen to my story until the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The mayor's words were a public jab, but the cut that went deepest came from my own family. My son-in-law, Mark, who was standing right behind me, leaned in close. He thought he was whispering, but he made sure the council members could hear every single word. "They gave him a ghost, not a gift," he sneered. "What's an old man going to do with a derelict station except wait for it to collapse on him?" I felt my jaw tighten, the muscles in my neck going rigid. I didn't turn around. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I just focused on the ink flowing from the pen onto the deed, my signature shakier than I wanted it to be. In their eyes, I wasn't just old, I was useless. As forgotten and broken down as the very station they were all mocking. The feeling of that moment, the heat of shame mixed with a cold, quiet anger, settled deep in my bones. It was a weight I knew I'd be carrying for a long time. I don't remember walking out of that town hall. I just remember the feeling of the heavy oak doors closing behind me and the sudden silence of the street. I was clutching that deed like it was the last life raft in a storm. The paper was crisp, but it felt heavy with the weight of their scorn. I could still feel their eyes on my back, could almost hear the whispers turning into outright laughter the second I was out of sight. I walked home, my gaze fixed on the cracked pavement, not wanting to meet anyone's eye. The station wasn't just a pile of wood to me. It was where I first laid eyes on my Eleanor, where I asked her to be my wife under the grand clock that now hung broken. It was where our life together really began. The building held the echoes of my greatest joys, and they had just spat on its memory and on mine. The next morning I went to see my inheritance up close. The sun was trying to break through the morning mist, but the old station seemed to swallow the light. The tracks leading up to it were choked with weeds so thick they looked like a green carpet. The magnificent brickwork was stained with years of neglect, and most of the tall, arched windows were shattered, leaving dark, gaping holes like empty eye sockets. I pushed open the heavy main door, and the sound of it groaning on its rusted hinges echoed through the vast, empty hall. Dust motes danced in the few beams of light that pierced the gloom. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting wood, and 100 forgotten years. It was a sad, lonely place. But, as I stood there, surrounded by decay, I didn't feel despair. I felt a strange sense of kinship. We were both relics, the station and I, and maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to stand tall again. My first step was a trip to the local hardware store. I needed lumber, nails, and a good sturdy hammer. Frank, the owner, a man I've known since he was a boy, watched me load the supplies into my old pickup truck. He leaned against the doorframe, a toothpick rolling from one side of his mouth to the other. "Starting a big project, Arthur?" he asked, a knowing look in his eye. I just nodded. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "You patching up history, or just wasting good wood on that old ghost?" His words weren't as sharp as Mark's, but they carried the same message. This was a fool's errand. I paid for my things, loaded my truck, and drove away without another word. The whole town was watching, waiting for me to fail. The loneliness of it all was a physical thing, a heavy coat I couldn't take off. But underneath it a small, stubborn fire started to burn. I would not let them be right. I wasn't born into a world of deeds and inheritances. My life started with the rumble of the trains that ran through Oak Haven. My father was a signalman, and his father before him had laid some of the very tracks that led to the station. We lived in a small company house, and the smell of coal smoke and steel was the first thing I knew. It wasn't a hard life, but it was an honest one. You worked, you came home tired, you put food on the table, and you took pride in being part of the great iron artery that kept the country alive. The railroad wasn't just a job, it was our identity. It was the rhythm of our town, the beat of its heart, and I was proud to be a part of it, just like my father was. I started on the line when I was just 17, greasing axles and learning the complex language of the engines. The older mechanics, men with grease permanently etched into the lines of their hands, taught me everything. They taught me how to listen to an engine and know what it needed, how to feel the vibrations in the track and understand the story they were telling. It was hard, dirty work, but there was a dignity in it. Every morning, watching the first train of the day pull out of the station, I felt like I was part of something immense, something that connected our small town to the entire world. I never wanted to be the man in the suit who owned the railroad. I wanted to be the man who kept it running. It was at that station that I first saw her, Eleanor. She was waiting for the 7:30 a.m. train to take her to her job as a librarian's assistant in the next county. The morning sun was streaming through the high arched windows, and it caught her hair, turning it to spun gold. She was holding a book, lost in its pages, and she had the most serene smile I had ever seen. I was just a young mechanic, my hands and face smudged with grease, and I felt 100 miles away from her world. But in that moment, standing there in the bustling, noisy station, the world went quiet. All I could see was her. It took me a month to work up the courage to even say hello. Our courtship was written on the schedule of that railway. I'd walk her to the platform every morning and be there waiting when her train returned in the evening. We'd sit on the polished oak benches, talking for hours until the station master started turning out the lights. The grand clock in the main hall became the keeper of our time. Its steady ticking was the soundtrack to our conversations, our shared silences, and the moment I first held her hand. The station wasn't just a backdrop to our love story, it was a character in it. It was the place that brought her to me, and the place that took her away each day, making her return in the evening all the sweeter. I asked her to marry me right there, on Platform 1, under that very clock. It was a Tuesday evening, just after the last train had pulled out, leaving a trail of steam and silence behind it. The air was cool, and the gaslights on the platform cast a warm, golden glow. I didn't have a fancy ring, just a simple silver band I'd saved up for months to buy. I remember my hands were shaking, not from cold but from a fear so big it felt like it would swallow me. I promised her a life of honesty, hard work, and a love that would be as steady as the northern star. She cried, and she said yes. That station wasn't just brick and mortar to me. It was sacred ground, the foundation upon which I'd built my entire world. Our first years together were lean but happy. We bought a small house on the edge of town, a little place that needed a lot of work. I remember one summer we spent fixing the roof. I was up there, hammering down new shingles, and she was on the ground, holding the ladder steady, handing me nails. A sudden thunderstorm rolled in, and we got soaked to the bone, but we just laughed. We finished that roof together, cold and wet, but triumphant. Those were the victories that mattered. Not promotions or pay raises, but the small shared struggles that built a life. We didn't have much, but standing there with her, looking at our patched-up roof, I felt like the richest man on earth. I was a good mechanic. I knew my job inside and out. Over the years, the railroad offered me promotions, chances to become a foreman or move to a bigger depot in the city. It meant more money, a bigger house, a more important title. My friends told me I was a fool for not taking it, that I was letting a golden opportunity slip through my fingers. But every one of those jobs meant leaving Oakhaven. It meant leaving the little house with the roof we'd fixed together. It meant leaving the only home Eleanor had ever known. So I always said no. My ambition wasn't to climb a corporate ladder, it was to build a good life right where I was. Then Eleanor got sick. It started subtly, a tiredness she couldn't shake, a tremor in her hands she tried to hide from me. But it progressed, slowly and relentlessly. The doctors said there were treatments, specialists in the city, who could help manage her condition, but it would require constant care. The choice that everyone thought would be so difficult was the easiest one I ever made. I turned down the final promotion I was offered, a supervisor position in Chicago. I told them my place was here. My most important job wasn't on the rails anymore. It was by her side. My world, which had once felt as big as the railroad network itself, shrank to the four walls of our home. Those years were a long, quiet journey. My life became a routine of clinic visits, medication schedules, and reading to her in the evenings when her eyes grew too tired. I learned to cook her favorite meals, to help her dress, to be her hands when hers wouldn't cooperate. I watched the strong, vibrant woman I loved become fragile, but her spirit never broke. She never complained. In the quiet moments, she'd take my rough, calloused hand in her soft one and just hold it. I had made a promise to her under that station clock all those years ago, in sickness and in health, and I was a man who kept his promises. I never once regretted the path I chose. As Eleanor's world grew smaller, so did the station's. The passenger service was discontinued in the late 80s. The main rail line was rerouted to a more modern hub, 2 towns over. The once thriving heart of Oakhaven grew quiet. The ticket windows were boarded up, the grand clock stopped ticking, and weeds began to reclaim the tracks. Sometimes, on our drives to the doctor, we'd pass it. Eleanor would look at its decaying facade with a deep sadness in her eyes. "It's getting old and tired, just like us, Arthur," she once whispered. It felt true. The station that had witnessed the beginning of our life together was now dying alongside us. The day I lost her, the silence that fell over our little house was absolute. It was a physical presence, heavier and more suffocating than the dust in the abandoned station. For months I felt like a ghost in my own life, just going through the motions. The town offered its sympathies. The casseroles appeared on my doorstep, but then life moved on for everyone else. I was left behind, a relic of a past they were all eager to forget. I became the quiet old widower, the man you nod at politely at the post office but never really engage with. The loneliness was a constant ache, a hollow space where her presence used to be. One evening, about a year after she was gone, I found myself walking to the old station. I don't know why, but my feet just carried me there. I stood on the crumbling platform where we'd had our first real conversation, where I'd proposed, where I'd waved goodbye to her 1,000 times. I leaned against a cold brick pillar and closed my eyes. For a fleeting moment, I could almost hear the echo of her laughter carried on the wind, almost see her smiling at me from the window of a phantom train. The building was a ruin, a shell of its former self, but it was our ruin. It was the only place left in the world that still held the shape of our story. These hands of mine, they're not soft. They're a roadmap of a life spent working. Every callus, every scar, every ingrained line of dirt tells a story. These hands tightened bolts on massive steam engines. They fixed the roof on our first home. They tended a garden, and for 20 years, they gently held the hands of my ailing wife. They are not the hands of a man of influence or wealth. They are the hands of a man who simply did the work that was in front of him, day in and day out, without fanfare or complaint. They are the hands of a man who understood that your worth isn't measured by what you own, but by what you build and who you care for. That's why their laughter in the town hall felt like a physical blow. Mayor Thompson, my son-in-law Mark, all of them, they weren't just laughing at a dilapidated building. They were laughing at me, at my life, at the very values I had lived by. They looked at an old man, at an old station, and saw nothing but decay and obsolescence. They couldn't see the decades of hard work, the promises kept, the love story that was etched into every peeling layer of paint, and every brick of that old structure. To them, it was a worthless pile of junk, and I was the old fool who had been saddled with it. So when I bought that lumber from Frank, his casual joke about wasting good wood didn't sting as much as it might have, because I knew this wasn't a fool's errand. It was a pilgrimage. I wasn't just patching up a leaking roof or replacing rotten boards. I was trying to honor a memory. I was trying to prove, if only to myself, that some things have a value that can't be measured in dollars and cents. The station wasn't a ghost, as Mark had sneered. It was a witness. A silent, steadfast witness to a life of love and labor. And it was my duty, my final promise to Eleanor, to make sure its story, our story, was not allowed to crumble into dust. That's the part they didn't understand. They saw a burden, but I saw a legacy. Not a legacy of money or power, but of something far more important, a legacy of love. Every swing of my hammer wouldn't just be driving a nail, it would be an act of defiance against their scorn. It would be a testament to a life lived with purpose, a life dedicated to someone I loved more than anything. They could laugh all they wanted. They could whisper behind their hands and call me a crazy old man. But inside the quiet, dusty halls of that forgotten station, I was going to find something they had long ago lost sight of. A reason to keep building, even when everyone else thinks it's time to tear things down. The drive back from the hardware store was the longest 10 minutes of my life. My old pickup truck groaned under the weight of the lumber, and I could feel the eyes of Oakhaven on me at every stop sign, every street corner. It wasn't my imagination. I saw Mrs. Gable peek through her curtains as I passed, saw two men at the barber shop stop their conversation to watch me drive by. They weren't just looking at a truck full of wood, they were watching a spectacle. They were watching the old fool, Arthur Vance, on his way to waste his time and money on a pile of bricks and memories. The scorn was so thick in the air I could almost taste it, metallic and bitter like old rust. It settled in my stomach, a cold, heavy knot that told me this was only the beginning. The first days at the station were a battle against time and neglect. I started with the basics, clearing out the debris that littered the main hall. Heaps of rotted newspapers, broken bottles, and the nests of countless birds and rodents. The physical work was grueling. My back ached in ways it hadn't since I was a young man on the line, and my hands, though calloused, were soon covered in a fresh layer of cuts and splinters. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the profound silence. No one dropped by to say hello. No one offered a helping hand or a cup of coffee. The only sounds were the scraping of my shovel, the groaning of old wood, and the whisper of the wind through the broken windows, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness I felt inside. After about a week of this, my next-door neighbor Martha called to me over the fence as I was loading my tools for the day. She was a good woman, but she had a way of speaking her mind that could cut you without meaning to. "Arthur," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "I see you're keeping busy over there. Are you trying to save that old place, or just collecting enough firewood for the next 10 winters?" She chuckled, a friendly, neighborly sound, but the words hung in the air between us. Firewood. That's what she saw. A big, useless pile of firewood. I just smiled, a thin, tired smile, and told her I was just tidying up. I didn't have the energy to explain that I was trying to save a piece of my own soul. The change was most noticeable in the small, everyday places. At the grocery store, where I'd shopped every Tuesday for 40 years, the conversations dried up. People I'd known my whole life, who used to stop and ask about my garden or share a story about their grandkids, now just gave me a quick, tight-lipped nod and hurried down the aisle. It was a subtle shunning, a quiet turning of the back. I started to feel like a ghost, haunting the edges of a town that had once been my whole world. I was the man with the crazy project, the local eccentric. They didn't want to get too close, as if my foolishness might be contagious. The isolation was no longer just a feeling, it was a wall being built around me, one polite nod at a time. Then came the phone call from Mark, my son-in-law. He didn't ask how I was doing or if I needed anything. His voice was full of that strained patience he always used when he thought I was being difficult. "Arthur," he said, "I've been thinking. I know you're attached to that old place, but you have to be practical. I spoke to a guy the first no in the scrap business. He said he'd be willing to haul the whole thing away for you. He'll even give you a couple $100 for the metal. It's a good deal, a way to wash your hands of the whole mess." He presented it as a kindness, a generous offer to save me from myself. But all I heard was his contempt, his utter certainty that the station, and by extension my life's memories, were worth nothing more than a few pieces of scrap. The physical toll of the labor was immense. Each morning my body protested with a chorus of aches and pains. My knees creaked like the station's rusty hinges, and my shoulders burned from swinging a sledgehammer to break up a section of collapsed concrete flooring. But there was an honesty to that pain. It was the price of effort, the result of trying to build something. The other pain, the one that came from the pitying looks and the whispered jokes, was different. It was a slow-acting poison. It didn't make my muscles ache. It made my spirit tired. It made me feel small and foolish, and it was 1,000 times harder to bear than any physical exhaustion. One afternoon, I took a break and sat on the edge of the dusty platform eating a sandwich I'd packed that morning. The sun was warm on my face, but it offered little comfort. I watched the cars go by on the main road, people living their lives, heading to their jobs, their families, their futures. From that platform, I felt 1,000,000 miles away from all of them. I was in my own separate world, a forgotten island of decay. Eleanor and I had once sat on this very platform, dreaming of our future. Now, I sat here alone, a custodian of a past that no one else seemed to value or even remember. The loneliness was a physical presence, as real and solid as the cold brick wall at my back. That feeling was shattered a moment later by the sharp, ugly sound of breaking glass. I looked up to see a group of teenagers down the tracks, laughing as one of them lobbed another rock at the few remaining intact panes in the upper windows of the station. The sound echoed through the empty hall, a sound of pure, thoughtless destruction. I didn't get up. I didn't shout at them. What was the point? They were just kids, and to them, this was just a ruin, a playground for their boredom. But as I watched them, a profound sadness washed over me. The station's decay wasn't just from time and weather. It was from a deep, creeping disrespect. It was a mirror of how the town saw me. Old, useless, and fair game for a bit of casual cruelty. The invitations were the next thing to go. For 30 years, I'd been part of a weekly poker game with a group of men I considered my closest friends. We'd seen each other through marriages, births, and funerals. But one week, the call to confirm the game just didn't come. I waited, thinking maybe it was canceled. Then, on Friday night, I saw their cars parked outside Bill's house as I drove by. I called him the next day, trying to keep my voice casual. He stammered, mumbled something about a last-minute change of plans, that they thought I'd be too busy with my project. The lie was so thin, it was transparent. I had been quietly uninvited from my own life. The station had become a wall between me and everything I knew. In the quiet of the evenings, back in my empty house, I'd often find myself talking to Eleanor. Not out loud, but in my head. "They think I'm a fool, Ellie," I'd say, looking at her photograph on the mantelpiece. "They think I'm wasting my time on a pile of junk." In my mind, I could hear her voice, calm and steady as it always was. She'd tell me that what other people think doesn't matter. She'd remind me that the value of a thing isn't in its price, but in the story it holds. Her memory became my shield. It was the one thing their scorn couldn't touch. She was the reason I started this, and she was the reason I would finish it, no matter what they said or did. One day, a pickup truck pulled up to the station. It was Tom Henderson, a man I'd worked with on the railroad for nearly 20 years. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he was here to help. He got out of his truck, but he kept his distance, leaning against the door. He looked at the station, then at me, and shook his head with a look of genuine pity. "Arthur," he said, his voice soft, "what are you trying to prove with all this? The railroad is gone. That time is over. You're killing yourself for a ghost. Just let it go, man. For your own good." His words were meant to be kind, I know they were, but they hurt more than any of the jokes, because they came from a place of friendship. Even my friends saw this as a sickness, a delusion I needed to be cured of. The whispers eventually found a name. I was at the town diner one morning, sitting in my usual booth, when I overheard a couple of men talking a few tables over. They were farmers, men I knew by sight. One of them gestured with his coffee cup in my general direction. "You see, old Arthur is still at it," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "My wife says she saw him up on the roof yesterday. A man his age. It's a shame." The other man grunted in agreement. "Yeah, a real shame. The whole town's calling it Arthur's Folly now." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a project anymore. It was a folly. A public monument to my foolishness. The work got harder as I moved from clearing debris to actual repairs. There was a section of the platform awning that had collapsed, and I spent 3 days trying to rig a pulley system to lift a heavy support beam back into place by myself. It was dangerous, slow, and exhausting work. Cars would slow down as they passed, the driver staring at the spectacle of a lone old man wrestling with a giant piece of timber. No one ever stopped. No one ever rolled down their window and asked if I needed a hand. They just watched, their faces a mixture of curiosity and pity, before driving on, leaving me alone with my impossible task. Their indifference was a constant, silent judgment. The final public blow came from Mayor Thompson himself. He didn't have the courage to say it to my face, of course. It was buried in a small column he wrote for the Oakhaven Gazette about, quote, community beautification. He wrote about the importance of civic pride and then mentioned, without naming me, the quote, ongoing issue of the derelict eyesore at the old rail yard. He expressed his hope that a and final solution would be found soon to remove the blight. The message was clear. He wasn't just hoping I would fail. He was publicly rooting for the station's demolition, and by extension for my defeat. He was using his office to paint me as the problem. I started working at night. I bought a portable generator and a string of powerful work lights. The station, illuminated against the black sky, must have looked even more like a ghostly ruin. But I found a strange peace in the darkness. Under the hum of the generator, I was shielded from the watching eyes, from the whispers, and the pitying stares. The night was my accomplice. It kept the town at bay, and allowed me to work with a focus and determination that the daylight hours stole from me. In the solitary circle of light, it was just me, my tools, and the memories. The rest of the world, with its noise and its judgment, simply fell away into the shadows. There was a night, a few weeks into this new routine, when the weight of it all nearly broke me. I was sitting in the vast, empty ticketing hall, the single work light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. A cold rain had started to fall, and I could hear it drumming on the leaky roof, a steady, mournful rhythm. A wave of doubt, cold and overwhelming, washed over me. I looked at my blistered hands, at the mountains of work that still lay ahead, and for the first time, I asked myself if they were right. Was I just a crazy old man, clinging to a ghost? Was this whole endeavor nothing more than a fool's errand, a final, pathetic act of defiance against a world that had already forgotten me? The next evening, I decided to walk into town for dinner, something I hadn't done in weeks. As I passed the local tavern, I saw them, my old poker buddies, standing outside, sharing a laugh. Bill, Tom, all of them. The laughter was loud and easy. As I got closer, they saw me, and the laughter instantly died. An awkward silence fell over the group. Bill, trying to break the tension, stepped forward and clapped me on the shoulder, a little too hard. "Well, look who it is! Still playing station master up there, Arthur?" He meant it as a joke, a way to include me, but the others started to snicker. It wasn't the sharp, cruel laughter from the town hall. This was worse. It was the soft, pitying laughter you reserve for someone you think has lost their mind. I just nodded, pulled my collar up against the evening chill, and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. In that moment, under the dim streetlights of my own town, surrounded by the men I once called my friends, the truth settled over me with the weight of a gravestone. It wasn't just about the station anymore. It had never really been just about the station. In their eyes, I hadn't just inherited a worthless property. I had become it. I was Arthur's Folly, the old fool, the town ghost. And as I walked home, the sting of that realization slowly hardened into something else. Something cold and quiet and unbreakable. I was alone, utterly and completely, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a curse, it felt like a certainty. That night, after I walked away from the tavern, something inside me didn't break, it settled. The sting of their pitying laughter faded, and what was left was as hard and cold as the steel rails in winter. I went back to the station, the hum of the generator, a lonely companion in the dark. They had given my mission a name, Arthur's Folly. It was meant to be a brand of shame, a scarlet letter for the whole town to see. But as I pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped into the cavernous silence, I smiled for the first time in weeks. A folly, I thought, is only a folly to those who can't see the whole design. And they couldn't see a thing. They saw an old man patching a leaky roof, but I was securing a vault. They saw me clearing weeds from the tracks, but I was clearing the path to justice. They saw me replacing rotten floorboards, but I was uncovering a foundation they had tried to bury forever. Every swing of my hammer, every bead of sweat that dripped from my brow was not an act of restoration. It was an act of preparation. My work wasn't random, and it certainly wasn't foolish. I was moving with a purpose they couldn't possibly comprehend, because the true value of this station wasn't in its bricks or its timber. It was hidden in the walls themselves. I didn't need to stumble upon the secret. I didn't need a lucky break or a crumbling wall to show me the way. I had known it was there for 15 years. I walked directly to the old station master's office, a small, sad room with peeling paint and a single grimy window. I ignored the collapsed desk and the scattered, moldy papers. I went to the wall behind where the desk once stood, the wall that faced the main platform. I ran my hand over the plaster, feeling for the familiar imperfection, a slight unevenness that no one else would ever notice. My fingers found it. Taking a crowbar, I didn't smash the wall. I carefully pried away a section of plaster and lath that I knew was designed to be removed. Behind it there was no hollow space filled with dust. There was a small, perfectly fitted cast-iron safe, set deep into the original stone of the foundation. Its black paint was flaked, but the steel was sound. It wasn't locked with a modern combination dial, but with a heavy keyhole. From a leather pouch I wore around my neck, hidden under my shirt, I took out a single, ornate iron key. It was heavy in my palm, a cold piece of a long-held promise. I inserted it into the lock. It turned with a deep, satisfying thud, a sound that echoed not of discovery, but of arrival. The heavy door swung open without a single creak. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was not gold or jewels. It was something far more precious. There was a thick, leather-bound ledger and a collection of documents, rolled and tied with a ribbon that had long ago faded from blue to a ghostly white. I lifted them out, with a reverence that bordered on prayer. These were not just old papers. They were the conscience of Oakhaven, a truth that had been silenced for over a century. I untied the ribbon, my hands steady, and unrolled the top document. It was the original, hand-drawn map of the town, dated 1888. Beneath it was the town's founding charter. The ledger, written in the elegant, spidery script of the station's first master, Thaddeus Miller, told the whole sordid story. The men celebrated in our town square as the Founding Fathers, the great-grandfathers of Mayor Thompson and the other prominent families, hadn't founded anything. They were railroad executives from Chicago who had used their position to commit a grand theft. They had been entrusted with establishing a trust to grant ownership of the commercial plots of land to the very men who laid the tracks and built the town. Instead, they dissolved the trust on a legal technicality, buried the charter, and claimed the land for themselves, building their family fortunes on a lie. I knew this because the man who left me this station, my distant cousin Samuel, was Thaddeus Miller's great-grandson. He was a quiet man, a recluse who lived his life on the fringes of the town that should have been his birthright. On his deathbed, he had summoned me. He gave me the key and told me the story. He made me promise I would not act until the time was right. "Their pride is a disease, Arthur," he'd whispered, his voice thin as paper. "You have to let it fester. Wait until they are so sure of their own importance that they can't see the truth, even if it's right in front of them. The station will be your key. When it becomes yours, you'll know it's time." The inheritance wasn't a surprise gift. It was the passing of a torch. It was a signal, prearranged a decade and a half ago. I kept the secret locked away, telling no one but Eleanor. I remember sitting with her in our kitchen, the key on the table between us, and telling her the whole story. She wasn't shocked. She just placed her hand on mine, her touch grounding me. "Justice isn't about revenge, Arthur," she said. "It's about balance. You'll know what to do. Just be the good man you've always been." Her words became my compass. I wasn't doing this for vengeance. I was doing it to restore a balance that had been broken long before I was born. And so I let them laugh. I let them mock me, pity me, and isolate me. I let Mark call the station a ghost, and the mayor call it an eyesore. Their arrogance was the very sign Samuel had told me to wait for. Every sneer, every condescending remark was a confirmation that the time had come. They saw a broken-down old man obsessed with a broken-down old building. They were so blinded by their own self-importance that they had created the perfect cover for me. Under the cloak of Arthur's folly, I was completely invisible. I was free to work, to plan, to bring a century-old truth back into the light. The value of these documents couldn't be measured in a few $100s for scrap metal, as Mark had suggested. Their value was incalculable, but its power was very specific. According to the original charter, the land on which the entire commercial heart of Oakhaven was built, the 3 blocks of Main Street that housed the bank, the pharmacy, the lawyers' offices, and Mayor Thompson's family-owned restaurant, was never legally sold. The charter had established a 100-year ground lease, with ownership held in trust for the descendants of the railroad workers. That lease had expired 35 years ago. For over 3 decades, the town's most prominent families had been, for all legal purposes, squatting. Their legacies, their fortunes, their very identities were built on land that didn't belong to them. They owned the buildings, yes, but the ground beneath them? That belonged to the ghosts they so easily dismissed. It belonged to the memories of the Irish and Italian laborers who had bled and sweated to lay the foundations of a town that later scorned their children. It belonged to men like my father and his father before him. And now, the proof of that ownership, the legal power to reclaim it, was sitting here in my hands, in the dusty, forgotten office of the Oakhaven station. Holding those papers, I didn't feel a rush of victory. I felt the immense, crushing weight of responsibility. This was not a winning lottery ticket. It was a sacred duty. This was for Thaddeus Miller, who risked everything to hide this truth. It was for my cousin Samuel, who died with this secret as his only legacy. And it was for Eleanor, who believed in quiet, steady justice over loud, angry revenge. I was not just a wronged man seeking retribution. I was the custodian of a historical debt that had finally come due. The power I now held was not for my own benefit. It was for theirs. I thought again of the name they had given me, Arthur's Folly. How perfect it was. A folly is a building constructed for no other reason than ornamentation, a decoration. They thought I was building a monument to my own foolishness. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. The real folly was the town of Oakhaven itself, an ornamental facade of prosperity and civic pride built on a rotten, stolen foundation. My work wasn't the folly. My work was the wrecking ball, disguised as a toolbox and a bucket of nails. My plan had been forming for years, polished in my mind during the long, quiet nights I sat by Eleanor's side. It would be silent. It would be strategic. It would be final. I would not confront Mayor Thompson at a town hall meeting. I would not leak the story to the papers. I would not give them the satisfaction of a fight. Their way was loud, public, and built on humiliation. My way would be the opposite. It would be done through the quiet, irrefutable machinery of the law, carried out by people they had never met, from a city they barely thought about. I carefully rolled the documents in the charter, tying them with the faded ribbon. I placed them back inside the safe, alongside the ledger. I closed the heavy iron door, turned the key, and felt the lock slide home with a solid thud. I put the key back in the pouch around my neck. I then replaced the plasterboard, smoothing over the edges until the wall looked just as it had before, a seamless facade of neglect and decay. The secret was safe again. I stood up, my back aching, and walked to the dirty window. I looked out, past the overgrown tracks, toward the distant lights of Main Street. They were all sleeping soundly in their beds, confident in their world. They had no idea that the ground was about to shift right under their feet. With the safe locked and the wall sealed, I went home and slept a dreamless sleep for the first time in months. The next morning, I didn't go to the station. I put on my best suit, the one I wore to Eleanor's funeral, and I took the bus to the state capitol. I didn't do it for revenge. Vengeance is a fire that burns the one who holds it. Eleanor had taught me that. She'd always say that justice was about balance, not about settling scores. And as I sat on that bus, watching the small towns of the Midwest roll by, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to tear down their world out of spite. I was going to use their own system, their own laws, to quietly and permanently set the scales right. I was going to honor the promise I made to Samuel, and the life I built with Eleanor. My plan wasn't to destroy them. It was to make them build something that would last longer than their lives. In the Capitol, I felt anonymous for the first time in my life, and it was a relief. I walked into the State Archives, a grand old building with marble floors and a hushed reverence. I spent the day with a clerk who looked at my documents with growing astonishment. He verified their authenticity, stamped them with official seals, and created certified copies. The truth was no longer a secret hidden in a wall. It was a public record, filed away in the state's memory, irrefutable and permanent. As I walked out of that building, holding the certified papers, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a single threat. I had just allowed the truth to be officially recognized. The loudest shouts in Oakhaven couldn't silence the quiet ink on that stamped paper. My next step was to find a lawyer, not in Oakhaven or even in the next county. I found a young, sharp woman in the Capitol, someone whose firm had no connection to the old family names that ran my town. I laid the documents on her polished desk and told her the whole story. I didn't ask her to sue anyone for damages or to seize their property. My instructions were very specific. We were to establish a new legal entity, the Oakhaven Rail Workers Heritage Trust. I would remain the anonymous benefactor. The trust's sole purpose would be to administer the rights granted in the original town charter. I wasn't claiming the land for myself. I was giving it back to the history it belonged to. I was simply the instrument of a century-old promise. I never saw their faces when they received the letters. I didn't need to. The legal notices from the trust were delivered by a courier one Tuesday morning. They weren't eviction notices. They were far more elegant and far more devastating. The letters informed the owners of the businesses on Main Street that they were, and had been for 35 years, operating on land held in trust. It then outlined the terms of a new, historical lease, a significant percentage of their annual profits to be paid directly to the trust. There was no room for negotiation. The documents were ironclad. To refuse was to publicly admit their founding legacy was a fraud. They were trapped. The very pride that led them to mock me was now the cage that forced them to comply. Their fortunes were now tied to funding the very history they had tried to bury. And so the work on the station began again. But this time, it wasn't just me. It was a professional crew of stonemasons and carpenters, their salaries paid by the first deposits into the trust's account. The town watched in stunned silence as Arthur's Folly was transformed, not into a pile of firewood, but into a magnificent historical landmark. The mayor and my son-in-law would see me in town and look away, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. I never said a word. I didn't have to. My justice wasn't in their humiliation, but in the restored dignity of the station, in the pensions that started going to the few remaining railroad families, and in the scholarship fund established in Eleanor's name. They saw a pile of rust and rotten wood, but I knew what it really was. It was a foundation, and on that foundation, a quiet, unshakable justice had finally been built.